excited. So thank you all so much for joining us for this month's webinar. Super excited for this topic. This is one of the ones that I was really interested in. Quick announcements before we get fully started and into our program. First off, we have an event tomorrow night over at the Central Florida Zoo. That's our AFP social. If you haven't registered yet, there is still a chance to register. You just won't receive our free tickets into the Central Florida Zoo's Sunset at the Park event, but we would love for you to join us for that. That's tomorrow night at the zoo. Starting at 5 o'clock, that's Central Florida Zoo up in Seminole County. We also have our next month's meeting is scheduled. It is on cryptocurrency, which is a really hot topic right now, especially in nonprofit industries, and how we can actually accept cryptocurrency as a donation. That is Wednesday, October 20th at 1 o'clock p.m. That will also be in this webinar format. And then, of course, we have our National Philanthropy Day this year on Friday, November 19th. It is at 9 o'clock a.m. this time. So we hope that you can join us for that event and celebrate some of our amazing philanthropists and nonprofits in the area. So before we get started with Dr. Maroon, I do have a special guest to welcome. Today's education session is sponsored by Victory Cup, and we have Brittany Pilcher, who is was a 2020 finalist, to speak on their behalf. So Brittany, take it away.
Thanks, Laura, and hello, everyone. For those who are not familiar, Victory Cup is honored to celebrate their 7th year, inspiring excellence in our community, one story at a time. So the Victory Cup initiative is dedicated to equipping Central Florida nonprofits with the skills and training to better tell their story. And it's a really amazing, fun competition. So what will happen is 10 nonprofits will be selected as finalists to participate in a storytelling training. Then they will work to craft their story into just 2 minutes, pitch it to a room of hopefully in person, hundreds of people, if not virtually. And then the chance to win 3 prizes. There's a first prize place, $20,000. Second prize is $15,000, and third is $10,000. The remaining seven finalists do walk away with $1,000, which is wonderful. And I know this because, like Laura mentioned, Center for Independent Living was the 3rd place winner for 2020's Victory Cup. And this competition, it's more than just the money, the prize money. It really is just an incredible experience to be selected. It gives your organization the ability to speak to people that you haven't had the chance to speak to, people that might not know about your mission. It opens the doors for getting board members, volunteers, additional donors, just that exposure that you so desperately are trying to get. It really is a great platform for that. So this all sounds great. Brittany, how can I be one of these finalists? Well, first you have to apply, and applications will open on October 1st. Now, I'm going to go over the eligibility requirements, and this is all on their website, which I'll drop in the chat right now for you all to check out. The eligibility requirements is your nonprofit organization must be serving Orange, Seminole, or Osceola County. It must have its 501c3 status, headquartered, it says national, headquartered outside of this geographic area. So the Orange, Seminole, or Osceola won't be considered. So if you are just a branch of a national chapter, I don't think that would qualify, but you can always email to make sure before you apply, and I'll drop the email in there as well. All applications must have a reviewed nonprofit profile from Central Florida Foundation. And if you're not aware of that, you can also, they're going to be doing an informational session tomorrow, a webinar, I believe at 1 p.m. I'll put the information in the chat. It's definitely, you want to check it out. They'll talk about Central Florida Foundation, how you can get your profile updated. And then also if you won, like ourselves in 2020, or if you won in 2019, 2020, or 2021, unfortunately, you're not eligible to apply again. Important dates. So applications are open October 1st through 27th. Must have that completed and reviewed Central Florida Foundation profile. And the deadline to get your application is the 27th. Applications are not cumbersome. They're very simple. You might want to collaborate with some people on your team with it, but it's not overwhelming. And I want to say, if you applied in years past and you have not been one of the finalists, do not get discouraged. It took us 3 years of applying to become one of the finalists. And I will say, I'm glad that it did, because every application got stronger because of it. And we were in the right place we needed to be in 2020 to speak to the individuals. So if you have any specific questions, you're going to want to email info@victorycupinitiative.org. I'll put that in the chat as well. And I just encourage you to apply and also to attend, whether it's virtual or in person. It's an incredible event.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that, Brittany, and for putting all of that information in the chat. And of course, a big thank you out to Victory Cup Initiative for sponsoring today's webinar. So we are super excited to welcome Dr. Bahiyyah Maroon as our speaker for today. And I'm going to give you a little bit of information about her, a little bit of a background. She is nationally recognized as a thought leader on equity and social change. She received her doctorate in anthropology from University of California, Santa Cruz. Dr. Maroon has provided strategic insights to Intel, Harvard University, the US Department of Justice, and the US Department of Labor, among others. And she is the Chief Executive Officer of Polis, an applied research institute dedicated to creating racial and economic equity in urban communities. She is passionate about deploying social science to create solutions that result in a more compassionate and equitable world. So without any further ado, let's welcome Dr. Maroon and her wonderful presentation today about board equity.
Well, thank you so much for having me today. And I want to take a moment to thank the sponsor of Victory Cup, doing really wonderful and amazing work. Of course, I want to say a huge thank you to Michael Slaymaker for helping to facilitate my participation today. Just adore everything that you do in our community. And of course, thank you to AFP for having me here to speak with all of you today. So again, I'm Dr. Bahiyyah Maroon, and what I want to talk with you about over the next 20 minutes to a half an hour, and then open it up for some question and conversation. What I want to talk to you about is the notion of inclusive belonging. And so we're all really being inundated right now with these wonderful acronyms. So we have DE&I, diversity, equity, inclusion. We have ideas, inclusion, diversity, equity, accessibility. We have JEDI work, justice, equity, diversity, inclusion. And all of our organizations, hopefully, are trying to figure out what's the right acronym and what work are we supposed to be engaged in right now. And I hope that at the end of our time together today, I will have inspired you and provided you with a few tips and tools on how to actually build inclusive belonging that results in relational shifts and transformations. We all want to make structural change. We know we need to make structural change, but the truth is that the best laid structural plans, for those of you who have done strategic planning and you know they're on the shelf right now, but you're not sure where you see them in action, we know that structure doesn't proceed without relationships, and that's where inclusive belonging comes in. So the way that I want to proceed right now is to share a little bit with you about my own background to give you a sense of the incredible impact that is available to each of us when we start thinking about having and facilitate having genuinely inclusive boards. I want to share with you a little bit about where we are nationally specific to board representation in the nonprofit sector. And then we'll talk about some key tips that you can utilize to create inclusive belonging at your organizations, particularly at the board level. So I am a queer Black woman, and I also happen to have a disability. And any number of categories that I fit into, I can also, to a degree, pass, which means that it's not necessarily always clear to people that I have a disability. People are often either not sure if I'm Black, or after a while, they start to feel like it's okay to pretend I'm not Black. And then very often, people may not be aware that I'm queer and a member of the LGBTQ community. And what that means in my work is that over the last, next year will be my 20th anniversary. Over the last 20 years of working with executive leaders and working with boards of directors, I would say somewhere between 1 to 8 times a week, every single week, I am exposed to astonishingly offensive commentary from people who don't really understand that they are not in company to be making the statements that they're making to me directly. And I share that with you because what that experience week over week and month over month, what that experience of having people say the quiet part out loud has resulted in, for me, is a really profound understanding of how much more we all have to do to build relationships of understanding and opportunity. And that happens by intentional work. The power of choosing to do this work, for me, is really best exemplified by my very, very, very first board appointment when I was 14. And before I tell you about that appointment, I want to tell you a little bit more about where I was in the world at 14. My neighborhood had a 67% rate of African American residents. My neighborhood also had a 30% poverty rate. So about a third of residents in our neighborhood were impoverished. Another significant portion of people in my neighborhood were right above the poverty threshold. So people really having financial challenges. We went to a D school, meaning that the school was failing and the likelihood of graduation for folks was relatively low. The likelihood of going to college was very low. The likelihood of getting a graduate degree was non-existent. And there's a resource any of you can avail yourselves of. It's called Opportunity Atlas. And that's opportunityatlas.org. And what they've done is they have tracked the outcomes based on your neighborhood. So what's likely to happen for a youth that grows up in a neighborhood that has a 30% poverty rate, that has a 27% high school dropout rate, that has only an 8% rate of college graduates? What is likely for the children in that neighborhood? And according to statistics, I certainly should not have a PhD right now. I should not be in the top 20% of income earners in the United States. That's completely out of my predictive realm of possibility. And I very often look to better understand what made my own arc possible. because it's not just a matter of an individual's willpower or my personal level of motivation. It also has to do with the opportunities, the mentorship, the guidance that we are given. It has to do a little bit with luck, and it has to do with communities that stand up for creating pathways. So in my county, there was a county youth advisory council. And that youth advisory council, I was nominated to, I believe, in the 8th grade. I served on that advisory council for 2 years. And I learned all about meeting minutes. I learned about board chairs and vice chairs and secretaries and treasurers, not that anyone was giving us money to make decisions over. And more than anything, I learned what it meant to be seated at a table of power and influence. And because I had that experience, it transformed my sense of entitlement to speak up when I got invited to other tables. It transformed my sense of comfortability when I got opportunities to attend events and conferences that would lead to my ability to get into college despite enormous challenges. And so that youth advisory council, that youth board position for me was one of the pivotal factors in what made it possible for me to have a completely unlikely outcome going from where I began to where the arc of my pathway has allowed me to enter. And again, I share that story with each of you so that 6 months from now, a year from now, when you are doing the really heavy lifting of helping to influence transformation in the board leadership structure, that you will be able to remember the significance of choosing to either create equitable structures or choosing to say the work is too hard. Every time you create the opportunity for inclusive belonging for people who don't traditionally have seats at tables of power, you are creating an opportunity for life transformation. That's what's at stake in this work. So let's look now at where we are as a nation in the nonprofit sector when it comes to sharing power in our boards and our executive suites. So the board source, which you all of you who know me love that I know that I love BoardSource. And BoardSource has its intentional learning report. It comes out annually, and they've just released their 2021 report is out in June. You can find the full report on the BoardSource website. And what the report shows us is not only that we have very far to go, it shows us that we have made no progress. And every single one of us in the nonprofit sector owns that. We have made no progress. Today in the United States, the population is about 76% solely white identified individuals. And yet, in our boards and in our executive leadership, we see that representation of white Americans is hovering between 87 and 89%. And what's making it possible for there to be a 10% greater representation amongst white people in our board of directors and in our chief executive positions, our C-suite positions, what's making that extra 10% possible is all the missing Black people and all the missing Hispanic people and all the missing Asian American people and all the missing Indigenous people who are not being represented at the board level. They're not being represented as chairs or presidents of boards, and they are certainly not being represented in the executive suite. Then when we take a look at what we see in the age breakdown, what we see is that the majority of power in our nonprofit boards, and again at the executive level, is consolidated in the hands of people who are over 55. This is despite the fact that we have a population boom in the nonprofit sector when it comes to millennials and it comes to Gen Z folks. We still have a consolidation of power that very directly results in what I think we can all agree is a form of ageism. When we look at the nation as a whole, we know that about 1/5 of our population in America suffers from one or more disabilities. And yet, on our nonprofit boards, and again in our nonprofit executive level, 97% of our nonprofit boards and our executive leadership is fully abled and identifies as having no disability. 97%, despite there being one out of 5 Americans with a disability. I am absolutely sure we can all do better. When we look at the LGBTQ representation, this is a really interesting data point because here we do actually see gains, but the challenge in these numbers is that the surveying of our American population to how many LGBTQ people are there across America is not now, nor has it ever been, fully reliable surveying. So when we say that 6.8% of the US population identifies as LGBTQ, that may or may not actually be accurate. What we do know is accurate is that about 90% of nonprofit boards and executive suites have LGBTQ, are represented by people who identify as heterosexual. And so that leaves the other 10%. So it's possible in this area that we're making some progress. It's also possible that what we know about the general population is not entirely accurate. But I think that what we can agree is that altogether, these data points, which I want to add, almost directly match the data that we see coming out of corporate America's diversity reporting. The last, I think, national report on that is available through McKinsey. And we see there that about 86% of corporate board leadership and executive leadership is also white American. Really, the only distinction in the nonprofit sector from the data we see in the corporate sector is this unique fact. The gender of our executives and the gender of our board representation is flipped by ratio. And so where you have about 66% white males and 20% white women running corporate boards and executive C-suites, in the nonprofit sector, it's actually about 74% white women who are represented on nonprofit boards, and 74% CEOs and 53% at the board level. So a difference in the gender dynamic, but exactly the same when you take the numbers together and you're looking at racial equity, when you're looking at disability equity. What these numbers mean is that the people who are at the forefront of leading the charge for change in our nation don't reflect the diversity of the communities that are most in need of equity and fair representation. And in fundraising, what this translates to is a culture, a landscape in which we have much to learn when it comes to figuring out how to tell stories about the need for contributing to the communities we serve that are based in showcasing the dignity, the resilience, the remarkableness of the communities that we serve. And so we all know in fundraising that most fundraising consultants in any number of data sets will tell us that the most effective way to raise money is to use a pity story, a grievance story, a story that elicits a sense of sympathy in the audience. But that pathway to fundraising very often elides the dignity of the people that we're telling stories about. And I want you to think about the disparity of storytelling between the arts community, for example, and the supportive service community. When we hear stories about fundraising that come out of the arts community, they're very positive focused. These are wonderful things that children are creating with their art. These are wonderful outcomes that happen in communities when you have a fully funded museum, and so on. When we look at the health research fundraising community, yes, there are heartbreaking stories, but there is also an emphasis on resilience in those stories. There's an emphasis on the families that persevere, an emphasis on the way that your fundraising dollars make lives possible. But then think about the stories you hear when it comes to education for poor minority children. When it comes to stories about workforce development for minorities. Those stories very rarely showcase resilience. They very rarely rely on dignity. And this is directly related to the inclusive belonging that's happening at our board levels, because in a healthy organization, it's our board of directors who should be at the forefront of our fundraising endeavors. So when we've got a healthy, functional board, and I know that that's not the case everywhere, so I don't want to act as if it is, but when you've got the healthy fundraising board, that board needs to know how to tell stories that are filled with dignity. That board needs to know how to think about the vision and the future of the organization in a way that truly serves and engages the communities that the organization serves. So with these things in mind, I want to share 4 ideas for how you can be part of building a genuinely inclusive board. It's really important to understand that inclusion is very different than representation. You know, if Larry Elders called me up tomorrow and was like, I want to be on your board, I'm a Black man, I don't want Larry Elders on my board. You know, I don't need that kind of a representation. That's not inclusive belonging for the communities that we serve, right? So it's not about having people who check these identity boxes. It's about having folks who are part of the conversation of the transformation that your organization is dedicated to making, right? It's not identity boxes, it's inclusive power sharing. And there is a marked difference. So the first step is, it's just discovery. So you take a step back, you say, what is the community? What is the issue that we are working on? And then you start pulling back the root to understand what's actually happening around matters of diversity specific to this community that you serve. So let's say that you're representing a childcare organization, or it's an arts organization. Does the population that you serve reflect the population that could be served? If you're a museum, is your visitorship reflective of the fact that Orange County is 25% African American, or no? If you are a healthcare organization, is your organization reflective of those population demographics, or no? Right? So it's discovering what are the contours of diversity in this community that I serve. Do we have representation of disabled persons within our service community? Do we have gender representation within our service community? Within the LGBTQ community, do we have representation? So you, as an individual fundraiser, you are taking a discovery position. And then you're inviting board members to discover, right? And I'll tell you, when we look at something like this from a poverty perspective, right? Let's say that you have a nonprofit organization and they're focused on the issue of poverty. When you start unwrapping poverty, you have to start talking about racism. If you're willing to actually discover down, you have to start talking about disability bias, right? When you see the percentages of disabled people who are in poverty, you can't then say, I'm going to solve for poverty, but we're not going to talk about disability bias or racism or gender bias, right? When you start to discover the contours of the community that you serve, you'll start to better understand what is at stake for your organization specific to that really inclusive involvement. The next step is to explore the perspectives from the folks that you serve. So this is actively asking your constituents, and I don't mean donors, I mean the constituents of the organization served. It's actively asking, what is working here in this organization? In what ways do you think we could do better to be an inclusive organization? What does inclusivity mean to you? What are some of the service areas you think we could improve on? So now you're bringing in the voice of the people who you serve. And this is fundamental to setting the table for a board for fundraising strategies that are dignified and inclusive, right? You're starting to ask these questions, you're exploring amongst the people that you serve. The next step you want to take is to identify what are the connections and what are the disconnects. So, what are you getting right when it comes to diversity and inclusion amongst the folks that you serve? What's working? There are youth boards in our area that are doing remarkable work. Shout out to OYA. There are organizations that have figured out how to elevate their level of participation from constituents. So what's working for your organization? But then not based on your opinions, not based on your board of directors' opinions, not based on your executive director's opinions, based on what you're hearing from the constituents that you have engaged. What are the disconnects? What is it that people are asking of your organization that thus far you may not have been responsive to? Where are those points of disconnection? And so identifying your connections and identifying your disconnects allows you to start developing a reasonable plan for the pathway forward. And then the last piece is obviously create the path. And here, I really, really encourage organizations to start with your constituents when it comes to board diversity. And that can look very different for different organizations. It may look like an advisory council instead of voting membership on the board. Workplaces have internships for a reason. They create pathways to participation. There are so many wonderful uses of advisory councils and advisory boards. And that's one way that we can start helping people come into our organizations. So look to the constituents first. What happens when the people that your board of directors decisions affect are in the room for the decisions? I started today by sharing with you what it feels like to be a queer Black woman with a disability, frequently confronted by people's unwillingness to actually see me. And so I'm often in the room where decisions are made about people who the people around me don't realize is represented in the room. You talk differently when you're understanding that you can't use phrases like these people and those people, that you can't talk about the folks who you serve in an abstract or an objectifying way because they're in front of you. And it slowly starts to change the way that our fundraising materials are designed, that our fundraising pitches are conveyed, that our board of directors puts out their requests, their asks for contribution, the ways that decisions are made. When the people affected by the decisions are present for the decisions, it changes the entire dynamic. The next point of invitation to inclusion is your staff. Now, I do know that there are many nonprofits that don't actually have a staff. I'm very sensitive to that. But for those nonprofit organizations that do have a staff, this is what you want to understand. When we talk about these data points about, 86% of executive level leadership is white majority. When we say like only 2% of executive directors of nonprofit in the United States are Black women, like these kinds of data points, they are not the same at the support staff level. So when you start opening up the boardroom to staff presentations, to a section of the board agenda where staff are coming in and staff are providing information or staff are understanding how the board functions, when you open the boardroom up to staff participation in some appropriate level, you're also creating another pathway, another pipeline of people of color, of differently abled people, of LGBTQ folks coming into the boardrooms and getting a sense, oh, this is how boards function, this is what happens, and so forth. So it's really identifying how staff can participate in ways that are healthy and positive, that are encouraging them. And it might not be at your organization, it may be another organization that they will become a nonprofit board member. And then, of course, the last kind of participation is expanding the network, right? And looking out and actively recruiting a board participants who don't look exactly like, and this is important, think exactly like your current board of directors. So what happens on boards is exactly the same thing that happens in organizations. Somebody knows somebody who knows somebody, and you need to start finding people you don't know. You need to start making cold calls out into the community and board dating, inviting people to come and learn about your organization the same way that you make cold calls for donors, right? When we think about expanding our donor network, there's a portion of it that's one-to-one. I know someone who knows someone who knows someone, but there's also a portion of it that is just plain cold calling. It's plain, I heard this might be good, and I'm going to follow that possibility. Expanding board diversity is exactly that same principle. And so these three features, and I encourage you to do it in that order. It's the constituents first, then the staff, then expanded network. That's how you can create a pathway to participation. But you can only do that responsibly when you and fellow board members have put in the time for the discovery. What is the context of diversity and inclusion for our constituency? For exploring, what does our constituency have to tell us about how we are connected or disconnected, right? And for identifying, what are the connections? What are the disconnects? How can we use that information to make a viable pathway to genuine inclusivity in which the people coming to our table truly feel that they belong and that they are welcomed? So with that, I'm going to close my remarks and open it up for questions.
Terrific. We are watching the chat, but we also, I'm going to change it so Dr. Maroon, you are no longer have the spotlight right now, so we can see everyone. And feel free just to raise your hand too, or speak up if you do have a question or a comment.
I will start. I can start with a question. Dr. Maroon, so I love the idea of expanded networks because that's so true that it's who you know, who they know, and it just continues in that same circle. So with cold calling and with reaching out to those different communities, obviously we start with those people that are part of the constituency, but how do you find the people to call, and how do you get that information? Because that's always a little interesting, especially for a smaller nonprofit, how do you find that information? How do I pick out a person to cold call?
So that really comes from your exploratory process. So when you're engaging with your constituents, they're going to start to tell you what that network of power is that is meaningful to them. And you can include that in your exploratory question toolkit. Who's a person in the community that you perceive as a leader? Who is someone in the community who's had a strong impact on you, etc. Oh, another great recommendation, and this is actually from Board Source, is looking at your affinity organizations. So the African American Chamber of Commerce, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce, here in Orlando, One Alliance, different affinity organizations are also good to reach out to.
Terrific. That sort of leads into a question that Becky had as well. We recognize that our board is not diversified, so we want to make sure that we are doing the work as well and speaking to and attracting diverse board members. We joined a variety of chambers, but it sounds like going more intentionally to some of these affinity organizations sounds like a good next step.
Well, it's a good last step.
Okay.
You know, I mean, the very first step is taking the time to do the reading or do the watching. I mean, there's so much on YouTube these days, but you're looking at your service area. It's healthcare, it's the arts, it's poverty, it's LGBTQ, it's children, whatever. You want to look at your service area and understand what are the disparities in my service area. If I'm an arts organization, what is the disparity of access to funding for independent artists of color? What is the disparity of access to healthcare for minorities, for poor people? What's the disparity? What's driving the uneven landscape that I'm seeing? It's not enough to say, you know, the majority of museum goers are white, and there's not a lot of Black folks. There's not a lot of Hispanic folks in our museum today. Okay, we get that. Our duty is to ask why in a structural framework, and then of our organization. So why of our country, why of our region, but also why of our organization. You have to do that before anything else. Otherwise, when you bring folks in, there are going to be some very painful, very unpleasant, very stressful, very difficult confrontations with people who didn't set the table. Like, nobody invites somebody over for dinner and you didn't cook anything. You know, you have to do the cooking before you can have the meal. So the very first thing is discovery. And then the next thing is talking to the people you serve, and specifically the people you serve who are coming from those disparities of access.
That's great. I see Karen says, thank you so much. Excellent as always. Thank you. Yes. And is that, she wants just to talk a little bit about Opportunity Atlas. Is that something we could deep dive with you and learn more about?
So the Opportunity Access is a Harvard project. And again, it's opportunityatlas.org. We want all of you to grow as well, but go to growopportunity.org. And what we've provided at Polis Institute is actually an index that's specific to Central Florida. And you can check out our neighborhood opportunity index, and you can see specifically for 1,700 neighborhoods in Central Florida, what's the state of opportunity among our neighbors. And that I can walk you through on a deep dive.
Another question from Crystal. She's asking, what diversity training do you suggest as a next step for us?
I really don't. So I really recommend that people set a guidepost for themselves, discover and explore. And so when we're engaged in workshops and trainings, certainly it can be helpful, but it can also be really distracting because you're still coming into conversations without a background. It's almost like we're all showing up for the final exam and we weren't sure what we were supposed to study all semester. And so the first thing is to really just take 4 hours. Like if you were going to spend 4 hours in a diversity, equity, and inclusion training, take those 4 hours, break it up into 2 hours this week and 2 hours next week, and then dedicate yourself to what is the disparity of access within my service area. And I guarantee you, in that discovery process, you will find the exact right diversity training for your service area. And I'll give you a really super quick example of why generic DE&I does not work. I recently heard someone giving a training and they talked in depth about the lack of wealth that resulted from redlining, right? Redlining is a practice where you can't get a mortgage. So they had this whole in-depth conversation, et cetera, et cetera. There wasn't any redlining in the South in the United States. There was no redlining. And when you look at the historic redlining maps for the United States, you'll see that the South is not included. We didn't need any redlining in the South because the South had segregation. So we don't need to have a conversation about why Blacks and Hispanics in Florida and Alabama and Mississippi don't own homes because they weren't able to get a mortgage because of redlining from the bank. That's not our conversation. Our conversation is what it means to only be 2 generations out from de facto segregation, in which people were afraid to leave their neighborhood on pain of their lives, right? That's a very different conversation than a conversation about redlining. But when we do these blanket, sort of cookie cutter DE&I things, we start talking about things that it's racism is the most peculiar institution in the world. And it is culturally specific. And the racism in Florida is a different set of issues and matters than the racism in Michigan. And we have to start taking a hard look at our local cultural truths and telling honest stories.
Thank you very much. We do have time for one more question. If someone does have something that they would love to learn more about.
Well, I'm going to fill in that space, and I want to make sure that everyone is aware of some of the incredible work that's being done by institutions in our community. So the Central Florida Foundation, in partnership with the Orlando Economic Partnership, is working on a Center for Inclusive Leadership. And the expectation is that sometime next spring, possibly summer, there will actually be a pathway for training board members from minority populations, and also a pathway for training boards of directors to have more inclusive organizations. So that's a program initiative that is getting going off the ground. And then the Edith Bush Institute is also putting together a series of tools, which I believe will be available possibly sometime in the spring. And that is through their Evoking Change Advisory Council. So in addition to that, the Orlando Economic Partnership is working on a diversity initiative in which businesses all over our community are taking a diversity pledge. And I think that for fundraising, for board development, and someone asked previously about cold calls and where to find people, I think when we start looking at organizations that have taken the diversity pledge and then identifying, do they have staff members who would be interested in learning more about our organization, possibly being board members. There are so many ways to grow inclusive belonging in our community. So those are 3 exciting initiatives you can look into.
Thank you so much for sharing those. That's wonderful. Great information. And if there's nothing else, well, we'll go ahead and wrap up. And thank you for your time and this insight. And obviously, I think a lot of us have a lot of work and research to start with, because this is for me, honestly, this is a new it's a new concept. It's a new way of looking at it. So thank you for that and for challenging those thoughts and bringing that to this group. The exciting thing next is that we do have a door prize for our people who registered. So Dr. Maroon, if you could pick a number between 1 and 34.
27.
All right, Michael, can you give us who's 27?
That would be Melanie Campbell.
Yay! And I think I did see her on. She was, I thought, but we'll get her that. Melanie serves on our board as our VP of membership. So very exciting to celebrate that. She's getting a $25 Old Navy gift card. So just a fun little prize. Once again, thank you so much for being here and for sharing this wonderful insight and your time and your expertise as Melissa has shared. And this was a wonderful session. So thank you for that.
Thank you so much for having me. And thank you to everyone who attended. And most of all, thank you all for choosing to take time in your lives to do this really important transformative work.
Wonderful. As a final reminder, of course, make sure you join Victory Cup as another thank you to them for sponsoring this event. That they have their question and answer session tomorrow at 1 p.m. We did share that on our Facebook page. So if you don't share follow the Association of Fundraising Professionals Central Florida Facebook page, make sure you do that. And I did just make sure that we are following the Polis Institute as the Association of Florida Fundraising Professionals. So make sure you give them a follow on their social media as well. We have our social on Thursday as well, tomorrow night at the Central Florida Zoo. I hope to see some of you there. And then next month, October 20th, we have our cryptocurrency presentation. So I hope you'll be able to join us there. And that is something interesting about that ageism and how many of our millennials and Gen Zs are actually looking at cryptocurrency as a new form of currency. So that'll be really interesting to look at that diversity on that spectrum. So without any further ado, thank you all so much for joining, and I hope you have a great rest of your day.